The Phantom Tenant. Sarah had always dreamed of living in the heart of the city. When she found a charming one-bedroom apartment in a historic building downtown, it felt like fate. The rent was surprisingly affordable, and the place had character, high ceilings, vintage fixtures, and large windows that filled the space with light. She signed the lease without a second thought. The first few weeks were uneventful. Sarah spent her evenings unpacking, decorating, and getting to know her new neighborhood. But soon, she started noticing odd things. At first, it was small, an unlocked window she was sure she had latched, a door left slightly ajar, or lights that seemed to turn on by themselves. She dismissed these incidents as the quirks of an old building and her own forgetfulness. But then, things started getting stranger. One night, Sarah was jolted awake by the sound of someone whispering her name. It was a faint, barely audible sound, like a breath of air, but unmistakable. Her heart raced as she sat up in bed, listening intently. The whisper came again, this time a bit louder, "Sarah." The voice was soft, almost pleading. Terrified, she jumped out of bed and searched the apartment, but there was no one there. All the doors were locked, the windows closed. She checked her phone, thinking it might have been some kind of strange call, but the screen was blank. The whispers continued, always at 3:15 a.m., always calling her name. Sarah tried to ignore it, but each night the whispers grew more insistent. She began losing sleep, her nerves frayed from the constant fear. During the day, she asked her neighbors if they had ever experienced anything unusual, but most just shrugged and said they hadn't. One elderly woman, however, looked at her with concern and said, "You're in Emily's old apartment, aren't you?" Sarah's stomach dropped. The woman explained that years ago, a young woman named Emily had lived in that very apartment. Emily had been quiet, kept to herself, and then one day, she just vanished. Her belongings were still in the apartment, but Emily was never found. Some of the older tenants claimed they could still hear her calling for help in the dead of night, though most dismissed it as nonsense. Desperate for answers, Sarah delved into the building's history and found old newspaper articles about Emily's disappearance. The details were chilling. Emily had last been seen alive by a neighbor, who reported hearing her arguing with someone late at night. The next morning, she was gone. The investigation had turned up no leads, and eventually, it was assumed she had run away. That night, when the whispers began, Sarah could no longer stand it. She screamed back, "What do you want?" The apartment fell deathly silent, and for a moment, she thought it was over. But then, a cold breeze swept through the room, and she felt an icy hand brush against her face. Sarah fled the apartment, refusing to spend another night there. She moved out the next day, but the new tenant who took her place reported the same eerie whispers at 3:15 a.m., and the feeling of being watched by something unseen. It seemed that Emily's spirit was still searching for help, trapped in the apartment where she had met her untimely end. The locked room. Tom and Jenna had been searching for a new place for months before they finally found what seemed like the perfect apartment. It was spacious, with 2 large bedrooms, an open living area, and a balcony that offered a stunning view of the city. The building was old, but well-maintained, with beautiful architectural details and a welcoming community of tenants. They moved in immediately, excited to start this new chapter of their lives. As they unpacked, they noticed a locked door at the end of the hallway. When they asked the landlord about it, he casually explained that it was just a storage room. "It's been locked for years, no one has the key," he said, dismissing their curiosity. Tom and Jenna thought it was odd, but they were too busy settling in to give it much thought. A few weeks later, strange things began to happen. Jenna would hear faint noises coming from behind the locked door, like something scraping against the wood. She mentioned it to Tom, but he brushed it off as the building settling, or maybe an animal trapped in the walls. But the sounds grew louder and more persistent, especially at night. One evening, as they were watching TV, they both heard it, an unmistakable scratching sound, coming from the other side of the door. It was slow, deliberate, and sent chills down their spines. Tom grabbed a flashlight and went to investigate, with Jenna close behind. As they stood in front of the door, the scratching intensified, as if something, or someone, was desperate to get out. The next morning, they noticed deep scratch marks on the outside of the door, as though something had been trying to claw its way through from the inside. They were both deeply unsettled and decided to call the landlord. He arrived later that day with a locksmith, who worked for nearly an hour trying to pick the lock. Finally, with a loud click, the door swung open. The room inside was empty. Dust covered every surface, and it looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. There was nothing unusual about it, no hidden passages, no signs of disturbance. Just an old, unused storage space. But as they turned to leave, something caught Jenna's eye. Lying in the middle of the floor was a small, old-fashioned key. It looked ancient, its brass surface tarnished with age. The landlord seemed unnerved by the key and quickly pocketed it, mumbling something about how it must have fallen from a shelf. He left in a hurry, leaving Tom and Jenna standing in the hallway, still shaken by the experience. That night, the scratching started again, but now it wasn't just from the door, it was coming from the walls, the ceiling, even the floor beneath their feet. The sounds became unbearable, a constant, maddening presence that followed them wherever they went in the apartment. Desperate, they moved out, leaving the apartment vacant. But the next tenants reported the same eerie scratching sounds, and the landlord eventually decided to leave the room locked permanently. To this day, no one knows what was, or is, behind that door, but whatever it is, it's still there, trying to escape. The Haunting of Apartment 305. Michelle had never believed in ghosts or the supernatural. She was a practical woman, grounded in reality, and when she heard the rumors about her new apartment building being haunted, she laughed them off. The building was old, sure, but it had a lot of charm, and the rent was reasonable. Apartment 305, with its large windows and cozy layout, was exactly what she had been looking for. The first few nights were peaceful, but soon, strange things began to happen. It started with little annoyances, lights flickering, cold drafts blowing through the apartment despite the summer heat, and the feeling of being watched. Michelle attributed it to the age of the building, shrugging it off as faulty wiring and poor insulation. But then she started seeing shadows. They were always at the edge of her vision, dark shapes that seemed to move when she wasn't looking directly at them. She would turn her head, expecting to see someone standing there, but the room would be empty. The shadows grew more frequent, and Michelle began to feel uneasy in her own home. One night, as she was getting ready for bed, she felt an overwhelming sense of dread. The air in the apartment felt heavy, oppressive. As she turned off the lights and climbed into bed, she noticed a figure standing in the corner of her room. It was tall, with broad shoulders, but completely featureless, just a dark silhouette against the wall. Michelle's heart pounded in her chest as she stared at the figure, unable to move or make a sound. The figure didn't move either, it just stood there, watching her. After what felt like an eternity, the figure slowly began to drift towards her, moving soundlessly across the room. Just as it was about to reach her, it vanished, leaving Michelle trembling in fear. The next morning, she asked her neighbors if they knew anything about the apartment's history. Most were reluctant to talk about it, but one older man finally told her the story. Years ago, a man had lived in apartment 305. He was reclusive, rarely seen by other tenants, and then one day, he simply died. The cause of death was never determined, it was as if he had just stopped living. Since then, every tenant who lived in 305 reported strange occurrences, cold spots, moving shadows, and the feeling of being watched. Some even claimed to see the ghost of the man who had died there, a shadowy figure that would appear in the darkest corners of the apartment. Determined to get rid of the haunting presence, Michelle contacted a local priest to bless the apartment. The priest came and performed the blessing, sprinkling holy water in every corner and reciting prayers. For a few days, things seemed to calm down. The apartment felt lighter, and Michelle began to believe that the spirit had been banished. But it didn't last. The shadows returned, darker and more menacing than before. The figure began appearing more frequently, always closer, always watching her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. Objects in her apartment started moving on their own, doors would slam shut, pictures would fall off the walls, and furniture would shift positions while she was out. Michelle couldn't take it anymore. She packed up her belongings.